Hello and welcome to Temporal, part of the podcast series published by Ahval News Online, an independent, critical, trilingual news site. I am Yavuz Baydar, editor of Ahval. Today we will plunge into the depths of the deep state, a murky term identified with much that is going on with authoritarianism, embracing democracies and semi-democracies. My guest is Ryan Gingeras. He's an associate professor in the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School and is an expert on Turkish, Balkan, and Middle East history. He is the author of 4 books, including Heroin, Organized Crime, The Making of Modern Turkey. Mr. Gingeras has also published on a wide variety of topics related to history and politics in such journals as Foreign Affairs, Middle East Journal, Diplomatic History, etc. Welcome, Ryan.
Hey, thank you for having me on.
Thank you for joining us. In a recent article with War on the Rocks, you deal with the subject in detail, deep state, taking the reader through history. For us from Turkey, especially for a person like me, a journalist, the term is more than familiar, of course. We have been following and we have been shaken by this term. Although I personally prefer the term inner state or state within, more proper, but it's only my humble view. You write in your blog or article like this, the following: almost 2 years passed since the deep state became a part of the American lexicon. It was in early February 2017, just weeks after the inauguration of President Donald Trump, that news reports first mentioned the term's increased use with the president's inner circle. Over the following months, the president and supporters of his administration publicly embellished upon the deep state's meaning and significance, making it into a catchphrase for perceived internal adversaries within Washington. And in a survey, you continue, when asked if the questionnaire, people were questioned, believed that there was a group of unelected government and military officials who secretly manipulate or direct national policy, almost 3/4 of respondents agreed that such a deep state existed. But for a historian like you, it was only a reminder of its very roots, Turkey. How so? Tell us, please.
I think, first of all, it's hard to avoid the connection since, number one, deep state is so critical to how people talk about politics and even the history of Turkey. I would say that, anybody who studies Turkey nowadays comes across the phrase readily. And so it was sort of jarring in early 2017 that this phrase not only emerges in the press, but becomes, sort of takes on a life of its own. And for someone like me, and somebody who's not only interested in the history of Turkey, but sort of more broadly interested in the history of organized crime and the influence that organized crime groups have played within politics, there's actually always been a kind of culture within the United States, or at least popular suspicion that something akin to a deep state, or what people in Turkey talk about being a deep state, exists in the United States. And this is a phenomenon that goes back quite a long time.
Yeah, of course. We know it from movies like Manchurian Candidate or Parallax View, The Conversation of Coppola, etc. All these movies on 3 Days of Condor. Movies.
I'd say JFK is even probably the most essential of those kind of popular culture, landmarks, where I think more than any movie, you see shades of it in movies and in TV shows, predating that, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But I think JFK, gave Americans a really concise and a far more coherent idea of, or a sort of projection that there's this parallel government that exists in the United States and has long existed in the United States and continues to endure. And I think that in its essence is what people think about in Turkey when they think of a deep state.
Mm-hmm. And you remind the reader of your days as a graduate student when you first suddenly, meet this term that, wakes a lot of interest for you. It was 20 years ago, correct? And it was in the 1990s where the term deep state was very popular.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think just for context, how it came about, was usually through one of two ways. The first time I think I really occurred, I'd heard about it was the very, very early 2000s, just after Erdogan was elected, and people would talk about the deep state not allowing him to take power or perhaps overthrowing him or undermining him in some way, shape, or form. And then I think it really began to take on an even greater significance, or it would come up more in conversation because of Kurtlar Vadisi, the TV series.
Valley of Wolves.
Valley of the Wolves. And I think that, sort of like JFK, that it crystallized in the minds of a lot of people of what this thing called the deep state is, right? This, it put a face on it, and it popularized it, and it struck all these notes within people's memories and their fantasies about the way the government worked. And it was sort of, again, it grabbed me because I think, I think that it's something that people, I think academically, in academic circles, were beginning at that point, or had at that point sort of begun to toy with or think about with respect to the early history of Turkey. And so that's something that, kind of inspired me in a lot of my work over the last several years.
Mm-hmm. But the deeper you went to this work, the deeper you chased where this term stemmed from. You went, further back into Turkish history. Where did you find its roots, and how did it begin? Please walk us through that.
Sure. I mean, let me sort of state up front that, to talk about it now is sort of awkward because I think the term has become so politically loaded, and that especially in the United States, especially in English, it's used in English, it carries this really heavy partisan, very political connotation, especially vis-a-vis the Trump administration. But at the time, I think, at least when it was used casually, it referenced the existence of parallel sources of authority in Turkey, or in like the enduring notion that there is a kind of theater of politics that happens behind the scenes, and which you have these, various actors, some of them a part of the government, some of them outside of the government, and this would be especially the case of, organized crime figures or organized crime groups and stuff like that, having an effect on the outcomes of policy. And these would be especially violent outcomes. And so, depending on, when you want to sort of begin to trace the history of the deep state, if you're going to give it that basic definition, I think you'd have to start with the Young Turk period after 1908. And you'd have to include, events like, the First World War, and I think especially events surrounding the Armenian Genocide. You could roll that into the development of the national movement. But again, I'd say that I say this now with some hesitancy because I think the use of the term itself becomes somewhat, somewhat harmful to the kind of, any kind of argument you make, because it gives the connotation that it's an organic thing, that it exists unto itself, and it sort of has it's an organization, or it's this organism that has this life of its own that continues through the decades. And that's not the argument that I would make. And it's certainly not the argument I would necessarily have made. I've made in any of my work since.
What is your point of view? That there's no continuity for this core parallel?
Yeah, I wouldn't say. No, I don't. I mean, if I had to guess, or if I mean, first of all, I think based on what we know and considering the kind of, I think, really big questions that still loom over the kind of evidence that we have that tell us, about, key, ruptures or key joints in Turkish history. It's clear that there are, that there are certainly conspiracies within Turkish history, and there certainly have been cabals within Turkish history. Now, whether that forms one coherent culture, or how do we trace that continuity beyond just saying that this is a phenomenon, is really hard to say. And I think one thing that, among the flaws that you see with people who really take this term very seriously, is that there is a deliberate effort to try to connect the dots through history and through various points. And I'm not necessarily sure that we can connect those dots beyond the fact that they reflect kind of ongoing internal tensions within the ranks of the Turkish state, and sort of different kind of competing factions that you have both within government and outside the government that determine policy or determine events in Turkish history.
Mm-hmm. But a lot of people argue that as the Ottoman Empire imploded, the Turkish nationalists, out of deep fear or even trauma, had to really enforce structures like Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa, the special branch, let's say, be connected with the Turkish nationalist CUP, Committee of Union and Progress, which led Turkey or Ottoman Empire to total collapse through First World War and Armenian Genocide, etc. And then you also write in the article that there was some sort of continuity towards the new Turkish Republic, where elements of that CUP, although Atatürk did not completely sympathize with them, helped Atatürk to construct the new republic. And then throughout decades, even after Atatürk's death, there was this loyalty to keep the Turkish state downsized, shrunk state structure up on the surface, and also when it emerged in somehow with the Cold War, when the Cold War came, and it sort of metamorphosed into a new structure where, for example, former generals openly stated that the pogroms against the Greek natives in Istanbul, 1955, was sort of a work product of that provocation linked with these parallel shady structures, etc., etc. So there is this continuity. If you, and a lot of historians make that, political historians make that connection.
So where my hesitancy comes is, I think you have to make a distinction between the CUP era, which, between, say, before 1908 to, at the very latest, 1926. Although I think one could sort of quibble over the dates and stuff. But basically, you have to make a distinction between that period in which you had a political party which had at its core a kind of clandestine subculture to it. The Unionists, the Young Turks fetishized clandestine politics. They fetishized subterfuge, and they fetishized violence. They, as an organization, they were very much influenced by the kind of clandestine politics of revolutionary parties of that time. And I think that's really important in bearing in mind, these events that you mentioned, whether it's again, Young Turk revolution, elements of the Young Turk era before the First World War, aspects of the First World War and policies therein, especially, I think, again, Armenian genocide is, I think, among the, most visible manifestations of this clandestine politics. Through the war, through the War of Independence and so forth. But I think post-1926, this is where I think it gets tricky, is I think it's very clear that that kind of clandestine politics comes to an end. The CUP goes away in some sense. It is reborn as the Republican People's Party. But I don't see any evidence that during post-1926 that you have of this kind of internal conspiratorial culture within the party. I've never seen any evidence to that effect. And I think if you project the CUP, what the CUP was forward, I think we could be misconstruing something that I think, I think we could be misconstruing elements of Turkish history and sort of projecting the existence of some sort of ongoing parallel structure that I don't know if necessarily that's really there. I think that certainly I would say that by the mid 20th century, by the 50s, 60s, 70s, there is a growing consciousness within Turkish political circles, and especially within military or sort of security circles, a consciousness of Ottoman history and a certain romanticization of the CUP period, and that they become familiar with these events. They romanticize, key figures like Eşref Kuşçubaşı, who is the head of the Ottoman clandestine service, and that there is, and again, I have a lot of questions about this. I'm a lot of uncertainty about it, but maybe you have people who have the desire to recreate structures like that. But I would not necessarily. I don't know how much I would draw that in continuity. I would say. Personally, a more conservative interpretation of it would be that post-1938, what I think you do see is that, like in a lot of governments, you have the development of independent fiefdoms within different elements of the Turkish state, whether it's the army or the intelligence service or the interior ministry, who develop, their own, where you have charismatic leaders or powerful figures who develop their own following or their own cabals, their own political fiefdoms, and maybe their own independent policies. And it certainly seems to be the case within, for example, the military, out of which we end up getting things like the 1960 coup, the 1960 coup and so forth. But I think to try to draw a straight line from, Talat Pasha all the way through to Sedat Peker, I don't know if that's necessarily, I don't know how accurate that is.
Well, what about, you mentioned it, the Susurluk, the so-called Susurluk incident, 1996, where suddenly an exposure happened, exposing police officers with some mafia figures and some dirty warriors, etc. And then after a while, it continued again. It's resurfaced again in another form, an Ergenekon structure, which, prosecutors then had depicted a picture of a political mafia, reminiscent of the five families in New Jersey, like, sort of a horizontal structure where the components often operated without knowledge of the identities of the other, but for a certain cause or objective. And if anything, I think Ergenekon in that indictment was a reminder of those the commission trial in 1980s, and then again you have. Very murky, still unclear attempted coup, 1915. And most recently, and probably we will wrap up our conversation in this, Özgür Özel, the vice chairman of the main opposition CHP party, I think about
Right.
3 weeks ago, out of the blue, started to talk about a decision-making structure, shady shadow structure, which went beyond political figures like Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the chairman of the CHP party, said, I don't have the exact quote, but he quite in detail described the structure again, engineering the current politics as of 2017, 2018, 2019 Turkey. And this was, Özel is an MP. And
Right.
he was very much in detail. I'm sure you may have heard that.
Yeah.
He said. So this is a continuous narrative. What about that? In 96, the Susurluk, Ergenekon, attempted coup, and then these things again resurfacing. What do you make out of that?
I really don't know. I think as time, I think over the last 20 plus years, I think one of the key problems is that the notion of a Turkish deep state has taken on a popular life of its own and becomes, a kind of set narrative that I think political commentators as well as politicians now sort of frame a lot of their revelations or confessions according to. So in other words, I don't think there's any secret that by the time we get, say, the first Ergenekon indictments in 2007, that these indictments resonate really strongly with a Turkish population that has already watched enough Kurtlar Vadisi to say this makes sense. And as far as Ergenekon goes, and I think, even, talking about sort of revelations post 2016 regarding the Gulenist movement, and even other sort of mini deep state, I don't know, I wouldn't necessarily call them scandals, but so-called revelations. For example, that, this tariqat or this other fraternal order is now taking root within this administration, is informing yet another sort of parallel state or, parallel structure or deep state within the Turkish government. I think one thing that we have to bear in mind is this, is that number one, what we know about different, where we get our information regarding these revelations are often comes through the media. It comes through politicians, and it comes through, politicians who are desirous of media attention. And it has come through investigations that have been determined to be demonstrably flawed. And so, if you were to ask me what happened to the deep state post 1996, or what is the deep state post 1996, I would come up with an answer that I would have to really, I would have to make with a number of caveats, meaning that there's so much. I think there's been so much dissimulation within the press, and also, a real lack of clarity regarding even what precisely, the deep state accomplished, say, as a result, of, or as it manifests itself in Susurluk. In other words, so we know that as a result of the Susurluk incident, we know that the Turkish government hired members of the Turkish underworld to be assassins, right? That's the basic principle. But we don't really know exactly what they've done. We don't really have I think that the accounting of this,
it's because the justice system failed.
The justice system failed. But I think, and this sort of brings me to the sort of the conclusion of, one of the main points of the piece I wrote for War on the Rocks, is that Turkey has a very poor culture of transparency. And it goes through and it manifests itself in a lot of different ways. For example, there is no real coherent way or sort of set way to declassify documents in Turkey, or for the public to have access to public, to information generated by the government. It's very clear that, the justice system has long been really flawed. It has long been very flawed, and this goes back beyond Ergenekon. And I think that kind of problem isn't just sort of shake people's confidence in what the government is, but it also makes it really difficult to even substantiate basic facts regarding the evolution of Turkish politics, or even the evolution of Turkish society, for that matter. Since the Turkish government remains the largest repository of historical documents, we don't have a lot of alternative sources. So I think that lack of transparency and that lack of openness, I think in the end, it not only aggravates this problem of there being a deep state, but it doesn't go very far towards trying to solve it.
Maybe it's the deep state that blocks access to information.
Maybe. But,
those suspicions, of course, are fueled by the lack of justice. Hundreds and thousands of people think about Saturday mothers seeking justice since mid-1990s. People who are unaccounted for, whose graves have never been found. The murder of journalist Uğur Mumcu, still unclear. Hrant Dink trial still going on with a lot of deep suspicions by his lawyers.
One could go back even further in that there's been a hesitancy within Turkish political circles to be open about historical events that are decades and even more than a century old, right? I mean, that, if you consider that, for example, anti-Armenian violence in the 1890s, I mean, there has long been a real hesitancy within, the Turkish National Archives, within the archives of the Prime Minister's, Ottoman archives of the Prime Minister's office, to release those kinds of documents. The Turkish military archives is open, but its access is somewhat curtailed and not necessarily, very transparent. And then there is even, for example, absolute access to the Interior Ministry's archives, going back to documents from the teens, the 20s and 30s. That is off limits to most researchers. I mean, there isn't, how one gains access is actually somewhat of a mystery. And one could go on and on in terms of different, ministries, or even the Turkish Historical Association having a somewhat, unclear or rather closed system in terms of maintaining records. And if you can't be honest about historical events that are over 100 years old, how are you going to be honest about events that are much more recent and much more, visceral and have much more of an immediate effect on the population? And I think that's the core problem.
Let's leave it with that powerful question. This is an open-ended subject, as the listeners might have noticed. Thank you very much for this conversation, Ryan.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you.
My guest this time in Temporal was Ryan Gingeras, Associate Professor in the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School, and an expert on Turkish, Balkan, and the Middle East history. We will deal with another subject in the next Temporal. Thank you for listening to us.